Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast hosted by Eric Rostad. Join him on his 15-year journey through the immortal books. He'll share what he's learning, explore profound ideas across time and cultures, and share the one thing he always hopes to remember from each immortal book.
Today I'm going to cover the tragedy play Helen by Euripides. This play is contained in Book 11 for my 2025 reading list. Well, who comes to mind when you think of the greats of Greek mythology? Maybe it's Odysseus or Achilles, Ajax, Menelaus, Agamemnon. There's so many people and so many characters to think about, but they all hinge, especially the Trojan War, it all hinges upon Helen and Helen of Troy. But Helen is not of Troy. She's from Sparta, so she should be Helen of Sparta. But we know her as Helen of Troy because she either went willingly or was kidnapped by Paris and winds up in Troy. And so we know her as Helen of Troy. That kicks off the Trojan War. And these great epics that we know, they all hinge upon this Helen. And that is the subject of Helen by Euripides. But if we were to know her as Helen of anything in this play, it would be Helen of Egypt. And that sounds quite odd. We'd never think of Helen being in Egypt, but there is a storyline, kind of an alternate reality of Helen. And that is what is contained in this story. So let me start by reading some words by Helen in this play by Euripides. So here's Helen speaking. "Yes, my husband, you've been destroyed, and countless thousands of bronze-armed Greeks. As for me, I'm detested, accursed, and my fate has been painful. A god tore me out of your arms, away from my city, the day that they say I left your home and your bed for a shameful marriage. But that's not what happened." End quote. Boom, boom, boom. Isn't this awesome? That's not what happened. Well, what did happen, Helen? Well, what we find out in this play is that at that moment where she was to be kidnapped by Paris or willingly going along with Paris, she was whisked away by the gods and she was instead sent to Egypt. And what took her place was a phantom. And this phantom accompanied her to Troy with Paris. And so let me read another section here of what happened. And so we start off here, and this is about the judgment of Paris. So I'll start reading here. 3 goddesses came to Paris, deep in the recesses of Mount Ida, to have a beauty contest. Hera, Aphrodite, and Zeus's virgin daughter, who was Athena. Their intent was to settle this question: which one looked the best? My beauty, and this is Helen speaking here, my beauty, if misfortune can be called beautiful, was the offer Aphrodite made to Paris. He could marry me. She won. He left the cowshed of Mount Ida and came to Sparta to lay claim on my bed. So that's the first part there. So it's this is known as the Judgment of Paris. There's this contest between Hera, Aphrodite, and Athena as to who is the most beautiful, and Paris is to choose. And Paris chooses Aphrodite because Aphrodite has offered him the most beautiful woman in the world, who is Helen. So the next part here, but Hera, so Hera again was one of the 3 in the beauty contest, and Hera is the wife of Zeus. But Hera was upset she didn't win, so Paris never slept with me, but only with thin air. The goddess took armfuls of the sky and made a shape that looked just like me, a living, breathing figment. She gave this phantom to King Priam's son. He thought he had me, but he really didn't. It was only an illusion. And let me stop there. So what we have here is Hera is so upset about not winning that even though Paris has won Helen, Hera makes it so that a phantom goes with Paris instead of the real Helen. And then Helen is whisked away by the god Hermes to Egypt. And she stays there throughout the entire Trojan War. So this is obviously an alternate reality, a different version of the story of what happened to Helen. And if this comes at the very second page of this tragedy play, and if you must be thinking like, how does this work? Like you can't just change the entire story. I mean, the Trojan War was based upon Paris taking Helen. So if instead he just took a phantom and he never knew that, and no one else ever knew that, but then Helen is in Egypt throughout the whole war, how is this going to play? How is Euripides going to make this believable? Because you got to think back to this time. This is a tragedy play performed in Athens. It is performed for a group of people who would know the entire mythology. They would know the entire story. And here Euripides is giving them in a completely different version of what they have known. There were other snippets of maybe this happened, but there's also a good chance that the audience here is kind of learning as we're learning as we read this play, because this is not what they're used to hearing. And so what happens in this play then is that Menelaus is returning from Troy. So this takes place after the Trojan War. Menelaus is returning. He has Helen, so he's gotten Helen back from the Trojans, and he's traveling back. It's kind of the time frame of the Odyssey, where Odysseus is returning home. It's the homecoming of everybody. But the ship is shipwrecked that Menelaus is on, and so Menelaus and Helen end up. Helen's already there, but the phantom Helen is with Menelaus, and they wind up in Egypt. And so Menelaus, he hides this phantom Helen, who he thinks is the real Helen, in a cave. He goes to meet with the king, and so eventually the phantom Helen goes poof. She winds up into thin air again, and then Menelaus is reintroduced to his wife, the real Helen, who has been in Egypt this whole time, and they have a reunion, a recognition scene, and then what plays out is the king of Egypt has just passed, and the play starts with Helen at his tomb as a suppliant. So she is in need. She needs help because the king who has just died, the king's son, is now after Helen because she is so beautiful, and so he's going after her. And so you see throughout this play, the son has eyes on Helen. Menelaus and Helen trick the son of the king, and who is now king, and they escape. They live out their days in Sparta, and live happily ever after. And they even get to go to Elysium. They get to go to the kind of celestial, heavenly place and live out their eternity there. So I want to read part of the introduction just on kind of what this play is going into. And so here is the introduction, which is written by Matthew Wright. The play Helen can be read as a dramatic treatment of these philosophical problems. And let me just take myself out of the quote. In the paragraph previous, Matthew highlights some of these philosophical questions and problems and things that people were thinking about at this time. Now back into the quote. Euripides' major achievement is to apply philosophy to the world of tragic myth, exploring the personal, human, emotional, and moral consequences of what may seem to be abstract concepts. What would it mean for us if we could not trust language or sense perception as evidence of reality? How could we form judgments or make decisions? How could we behave toward one another? How are we to make sense of our own lives in a world in which perhaps nothing is as it seems? Helen was a particularly good choice of mythical figure through whom to examine these questions. And I'll end the quote there. I just think this is fascinating. I loved this play. It's a wild ride because, and this is the final play that I've read that I'm reading by Euripides. And so if I go back, I'm reading these Greek works in chronological order. So I started with some of the books about the Greek gods and the mythology, and then I went into the Iliad and the Odyssey, and that is obviously all about the Trojan War, and then Odysseus' return after that. But that Trojan War hinges upon Helen, and it hinges upon Helen having been abducted and kidnapped. And then you go through the Greek tragedies, and so many of them reference this story, and they reference Helen, and there's just this there's a lot of anger at Helen. There's for being the cause of this war, for being the cause of so much death and destruction. And so you see that over and over. And then all of a sudden you come to this play and it flips all of that on its head, and it's a different version, and it's an alternate reality. It's a different version of the story, but it has to tie into the actual story. So how do you make that work? You turn Helen into a phantom. And but that means everyone then is fighting for a phantom. And what do you do with that? But then it just brings in other questions of, well, what do we think of Helen in the first place? Like, how many people actually saw Helen? And there's even differences in the story of, was Helen kidnapped or did she go willingly with Paris? And it's almost like a litmus test of what you believe, in the sense of, do you think Helen went willingly or do you think that she was abducted? It kind of goes into what you think of Helen and her character, and was she a victim, or was she a willing participant? And you kind of get different ideas when you're reading Homer, and you see Helen kind of thinking things through, and then in some of the Greek tragedies, just kind of getting deeper into her psyche. But here you have just this totally different flip, where she's been in Egypt the whole time, and now she's trying to get her reputation back. Her reputation has been just destroyed by the Trojan War. But if that wasn't true, if that wasn't the real Helen that Paris had, then maybe she can get that reputation back. So that's some of the things that this play goes into. It's just brilliant. I mean, it's one of those you just have to read, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. The version I read was the Hackett version, and it was translated by Diane Arnson Severlian, and then the intro was by Matthew Wright. I also read the intro to Helen that's in the Oxford World's Classic. I just got that book today, and that intro was written by Edith Hall. And I like getting these different versions. I mean, they're like $10 to $15, and I love them so much that it's just, and you can read these tragedies in a couple hours. So I just kind of have this idea that I'll have these other translations and maybe pick them up just at some point, and just kind of read a play here when I've got some time to kill. So for the rest of this episode, I'll have 2 more segments. In segment 2, I'm going to cover some themes and interesting ideas. And then in segment 3, I'll cover the one thing that I'm still thinking about after having read Helen by Euripides. All right, let's cover the big 4. These are the 4 things I always look at when I'm starting a Greek tragedy, and these are good things for you to consider if you're starting a new tragedy. And they are: who is the chorus, where's the location, who's the first speaker, and then what is the time frame, the mythological time frame of this tragedy. So the chorus here is captive Greek women. And there's also another chorus that's servants of Theoclymenus, who is the new king, the king that's going after Helen. He wants her because of her beauty, and so the Greek women are they're connected with Helen and sympathetic to her. The location is Egypt, which is so interesting. I don't think there's another tragedy play that takes place in Egypt, so that's kind of fun. At least the tragedy plays that have survived. The first speaker is Helen. She kicks things off and has quite the monologue at the beginning. And then the time frame is after the Trojan War. It's part of the homecoming part of the Trojan epic cycle. And just in general, there's kind of 2 main epic cycles that most of the tragedy plays are within. And so you've got the Trojan epic cycle, and then you've got the Theban epic cycle. So this one would be part of the Trojan epic cycle. As far as themes, I want to highlight a couple and then just get into some other interesting ideas that were a part of this play. So the first theme that comes up is name. And Helen says, "My name has been reviled throughout all of Greece. I want to keep my body free from shame." Another part, she says, "I've caused so much destruction, and my name has launched so many struggles." Then later on, "A name can be everywhere, a body cannot." So you get this idea, and again, just you think of Helen and was she kidnapped? Did she go willingly? There's just a question there, and it kind of it determines her name in the sense of what do you think about her? Is she a victim? Is she cunning? Is she just evil in terms of not caring about all these people who are dying just so that she can have an affair and leave her husband? There's so much caught up with the name of Helen of Troy, and that it's reached this mythological level where her beauty is just it's beyond compare. That her name is what we know, and she became whatever we thought. It was kind of that litmus test idea, and it goes into the second theme of perception versus reality. So let me read a few parts here. So this is Helen speaking, and she's speaking to Teucer here, and she says this: "Were you so sure of what you thought you saw?" And he replies, "I saw it with my eyes and with my mind." And Helen said, "Watch out, perhaps the gods sent an illusion." End quote. So just this idea of how do we know what things are true, especially when we're talking about stories like this and mythology. How do we know of what is presented about Helen is true? And to read this at the end of after having read the Iliad and the Odyssey and then reading these Greek tragedies, there's so much about this one version of Helen, and then all of a sudden it's a different version of Helen. And you read through this and you see, okay, I could see how this could work. I could see how, there were some people who were caught up and they thought it was Helen, but it was a phantom. And even Menelaus himself, he's with Helen as a phantom and doesn't realize it. Paris is with a phantom. And yeah, you got to stretch a little bit, but you can see how this could work. And it just kind of makes you think, what if everything I've thought about Helen of Troy is wrong? What if she was in Egypt the whole time? And that's just this kind of perception versus reality questions that come up. Menelaus captures the chaos quite well when he says this: "What can I say? I have no words. It appears that one disaster follows on another. I caught my wife and brought her back from Troy and put her in a cave to keep her safe. And now I learn another woman lives here who has the very same name as my wife. And she's the child of Zeus," that woman said. "Is there some man named Zeus who lives beside the banks of the Nile? There's just one Zeus in heaven? And where on earth is there a place called Sparta other than beside the lovely reed beds along Eurotas' streams? Are there two men named Tinaderos? Are there two different lands called Lacedaemon? And is there another Troy? I simply don't know what to say. It seems that many men across the wide world share a name, and so do cities, so do women. I guess that's not so strange." And I'll end the quote there. That's at the point where Menelaus is just kind of finding out that there's another person named Helen in Egypt where he's wound up, and he knows he has traveled with Helen, but that's the phantom Helen, and the real Helen he's about to meet. And so he's bringing up these questions here of perception versus reality. Then I want to highlight at the end here, or closer towards the end. This is Helen's shift and dealing with that perception versus reality as well. And so here's Helen speaking. "There's no man alive who doesn't hate me. Helen is the one, as every Greek believes, who left her husband and ran away to live in a golden palace. If I go back to Greece, back to Sparta, people will hear and see with their own eyes that I never really did betray my loved ones. It was the gods' ruses all along. That did them in. I'll win back their respect. They'll recognize my wise restraint." End quote. So here's Helen kind of going into there's this perception that's been about her, and it's deeply affected her. She's hearing that members of her family have committed suicide just because of the pain of all of this, and so there are real ramifications. The Trojan War was fought. There are real ramifications, but in this play, that's the perception. That is not the reality. The reality is that she has been in Egypt this whole time. So there's just so many mind tricks in this play, and where you just kind of, you wonder, like, what is real here? What's going on? But it's a lot of fun when you're reading it. A couple interesting ideas I want to highlight. I just read three different parts here. The first is bloodshed versus words. If all things are settled by bloodshed and battles, then trouble will never be gone from the cities of men. Many men lie buried in Priam's land, O Helen, when they could have resolved the trouble over you with words. End quote. That was the chorus speaking there. Actually, they would have been singing this in the tragedy play. But it gets into a theme that we see over and over in these tragedy plays of force versus words, force versus deliberation. So you have the option to talk these things through, for there to be dialogue, for there to be deliberation, or you can just go with force. So I thought that was a great section there. Later on, for human beings, there is no gift more valuable than wisdom combined with skepticism and restraint. End quote. You see this a lot in this play. There's just not this blind trust in the stories that have been passed along, but there's a real look into why, what's going on here? What is perception versus reality? What parts did the gods play in this in tricking people? Why did they do that? Why did they trick people in this way? Why was Helen saved? Why was she sent away to Egypt, away from all of this? Just a lot of interesting questions that go along with that. And here's the final thing. And this is a servant speaking here. The city was destroyed in vain. And he's talking about Troy. You might say that God preferred to hide the truth. Then why? Why bother with prophets at all? Make sacrifice and ask the gods for favors. Never mind the empty words of augurs. They're alluring, but offerings won't help a lazy man. Good planning is the surest kind of prophet. And then the servant leaves there with those words in the air. So again, just kind of a questioning of a lot of things here. Questioning why the God would hide the truth, and what is the purpose of prophets if gods are doing these things of hiding people, of creating phantoms, and so there's a lot of good, interesting questions that come up in this play. Next up, I'm going to cover the one thing that struck me the most in Helen by Euripides. All right, for the one thing, let me just read from the introduction here to set up the one thing. Even though the whole premise of the play is that the traditional stories are untrue, it gradually becomes apparent that the events of the plot constitute, in a sense, a repetition or reenactment of those stories. Once again, Helen is the object of rival men's affections. Once again, she becomes the cause of strife and bloodshed. Once again, jealous goddesses are at odds with one another, as in the myth of the Judgment of Paris. Once again, a sea battle is fought for Helen's sake between Greeks and foreign enemies. Once again, the glory of Troy is evoked. All of these echoes of the traditional version make it more difficult than ever to distinguish old, untrue versus new, true stories. They seem to imply, rather, that one cannot escape the past and that nothing is ever quite as it seems. End quote. I loved this. This play is flipping everything on its head. Everything you think you know about Helen, it's a phantom. It's a figment, and as soon as you grab that, it's gone. It's into the air. And the story here is that Helen of Troy is actually Helen of Egypt. But within that, in kind of, even if you distance yourself from the traditional story of Helen, it's like this story does the same exact thing. It's almost like there's this meta story of Helen that you cannot escape. No matter what you do, if you try to change the Helen of Troy story, you're going to wind up with a very similar story. And the brilliance required to write something like this, to make, first off, make it be believable to an audience that has known Helen of Troy their whole lives. They've known these stories, and then to have something that's believable, that she was just a phantom, but she actually was in Egypt the whole time. That's brilliant. But then to create an alternate story, but have it all tie in to the same storyline it's brilliant. And so I loved reading this play. It's just such a fun one, and one that you're kind of at the edge of your seats. I mean, you think of these tragedy plays, and those in attendance would have known the story. And so it's kind of, what's this playwright's take going to be on this? It'd be similar to us going to watch Titanic at the theater. Like we know Titanic's going to sink. We know kind of the main storyline of what's going to happen. And so what we're going for is just what about the people? What do we see about their lives? What could be a story of people on that ship, and perhaps a love story or something? Kind of digging in deeper to the story and thinking through, like, what would this have meant for someone as the ship is sinking, and how did people's lives lead up to that, to the time on that ship? And that's a lot of what the tragedy plays are. Just kind of, we know the general storyline, but these just go deeper and then look at questions, and they're so fun to read. But here you've got one where everything is flipped on its head. The audience just must have been on the edge of their seats. This play is so funny. There's some just humorous parts of it. So you just imagine the laughter in the theater as this play is being performed. It must have just been an absolute delight. I think it's interesting that it's the last play by Euripides that I read, and just how it ties together a lot of the mythology, and just what I put there as my one thing, that even though this flips everything on its head, there is still a similar storyline. You can't get away from Helen of Troy. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I'd love to hear from you, especially if you've read Helen by Euripides. I'd love to hear if you got something else out of it that I completely missed, or if I got something incorrect, or something that really stuck out to you that you want to share about this play. For what I'm currently reading, I am still in Euripides. There are a few plays I want to reread just because I didn't think I captured them in the first reading well. And so I'm getting a different translation, another intro, and reading through maybe one or two more. I also have the fragments of Euripides that I want to go through. Those are two of the Green Loeb books, and I just love reading those. We've lost the majority of plays by Euripides, and so what these fragments books do is go through the plays that have been lost. And so we might have fragments of them from other authors who quoted them. We might have fragments that we found of these plays, the actual parts of the plays. And so these will be in this book about the fragments. And I love them because and I've read other books of fragments by the tragedy playwrights, but I love them because you just get a little snippet, and it might be just like this brilliant statement from the tragedy play, and it just makes you think, like, what was the context? Who was speaking to who here? Why did they say this? What was this in response to? Where are they? What part of the play is this? Are they happy? Are they sad? What's going on? And so your mind just kind of goes wild while you're reading these. And the hope is that maybe we do find these full plays someday. But reading the little fragments of it is really exciting. So I'm looking forward to that. That'll close out Euripides, and then I'm going to get into Aristophanes, the comedy writer, and looking forward to that. You can follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter. It's just @Books of Titans, and I've got reading lists up there. I've got all podcast episodes, and you can also get tips and ways to create a reading list and learn how to remember what you read and just different things I've learned along the way. I'll be back next week with another play by Euripides. Until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.